While virtually everyone in the country, namely elites in the media and in Washington, D.C., are paying tribute to George H.W. Bush right now, who passed at the age of 94, I want to take the time to pay tribute to a different set of people who passed away. Because it's really easy to reminisce about all of the good things that he's done, and certainly he's done his share of good. And he was by no means the worst president, even in modern history, because I think that that award goes to his son. But him passing doesn't change the fact that he was a war criminal, and he should have spent his last days in a prison cell because of all of the atrocities that he committed. Now, it makes me uncomfortable to speak that way about someone who just passed away a couple of days ago, but that doesn't change the fact that this individual is responsible for thousands of deaths, both direct and indirect deaths that he caused. And he should have been prosecuted and imprisoned for what he did. And I'm not even going to pretend like I could give you an exhaustive list of all the horrible things or the good things that he's done, because that's almost impossible for a short podcast. But there have been political scientists and authors and investigative journalists who have produced countless documentaries and books about this man's true legacy that you're not hearing about in the mainstream media. So we're going to go through some of the reasons why this individual is a war criminal. And what we're going to do ultimately is pay tribute to his victims, because there are tens of thousands that were negatively affected, whose families are still suffering till this day because of what this individual did as president. So as Mehdi Hassan of The Intercept reports, under Bush Sr., the U.S. dropped a whopping 88,500 tons of bombs on Iraq and Iraqi-occupied Kuwait, many of which resulted in horrific civilian casualties. In February of 1991, for example, a U.S. strike on an air raid shelter in the Amaraya neighborhood of Baghdad killed at least 408 Iraqi civilians. According to Human Rights Watch, the Pentagon knew the Amaraya facility had been used as a civil defense shelter during the Iran-Iraq War, and yet had attacked without warning. It was, concluded HRW, a serious violation of the laws of war. U.S. bombs also destroyed essential Iraqi civilian infrastructure, from electricity generating and water treatment facilities to food processing plants and flour mills. This was no accident. As Barton Gellman of the Washington Post reported in June of 1991, some targets, especially late in the war, were bombed primarily to create post-war leverage over Iraq, not to influence the course of the conflict itself. Planners now say their intent was to destroy or damage valuable facilities that Baghdad could not repair without foreign assistance. Because of these goals, damage to civilian structures and interests, invariably described by briefers during the war as collateral and unintended, was sometimes neither. Got that? The Bush administration deliberately targeted civilian infrastructure for leverage over Saddam Hussein. How is that not terrorism? As a Harvard public health team concluded in June 1991, less than 4 months after the end of the war, the destruction of Iraqi infrastructure had resulted in acute malnutrition and epidemic levels of cholera and typhoid. By January of 1992, Beth Osborne DuPont, a demographer with the U.S. Census Bureau, was estimating that Bush's Gulf War had caused the deaths of 158,000 Iraqis, including 13,000 immediate civilian deaths and 70,000 deaths from the damage done to electricity and sewage treatment plants. DuPont's numbers contradicted the Bush administration's, and she was threatened by her superiors with dismissal for releasing, quote, false information. So let's just pause for a moment here and isolate one number: the 13,000 civilian casualties caused by his war. 13,000 deaths is a difficult number for the human brain to grasp. So just think of one individual. Think of the impact that that had on that person's family after they were killed. A foreign invader killed a member of their family. They were grief-stricken. They felt pain. Not to mention, they were dealing with a crisis caused by the United States in their country. Problems with sewage and electricity. So they couldn't even take the time to grieve because they were trying to save their own lives. They were dealing with an ongoing crisis that George H.W. Bush caused. Now, think of that one example or anecdote that I'm speculating about and multiply that by 13,000. It's a level of sadness and just pure pain and suffering that is really, it's incomprehensible. But that was not all, because there was the infamous highway of death situation that isn't often discussed, where George H.W. Bush ordered the United States military to corner and slaughter members of the Iraqi army who were actually retreating. They were headed back to Iraq, and this led to an estimated 2,000 deaths of Iraqi soldiers who were no longer battling. Again, they were retreating. And photographer Kenneth Jarrick was positive that this photo that I'm showing you of a charged soldier that he took would change people's minds about the war. It would turn public opinion. But it later became known as the war photo no one would publish since the media refused to display it. And till this day, we don't really view that war in the way it should be viewed. And not to mention, I am leaving out a really important detail, how Bush got us into that war, because much like his son, he lied us into a war in the Middle East.
The fact of Saddam Hussein's aggression is beyond dispute. But what about the campaign to commit American troops to liberate Kuwait? To get Americans, perhaps any people, to support a war in a place millions barely heard of, certain buttons must be pressed. In the run-up to the Gulf War, one image, one presence touched American hearts and minds like no other. It was this 15-year-old Kuwaiti girl identified only as Nayira.
Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, my name is Nayira, and I just came out of Kuwait. While I was there, I saw the Iraqi soldiers come into the hospital with guns. They took the babies out of the incubators. Took the incubators and left the children to die on the cold floor.
President Bush repeated the incubator story at least 10 times in the following weeks.
Babies pulled from incubators and scattered like firewood across the floor.
There was plenty of evidence of Iraqi brutality, but the incubator story became almost a rallying cry. Where did the story come from? We can't answer that. We can tell you about Nayira. She was no ordinary witness. She's a member of the Kuwaiti royal family, related to the Emir of Kuwait. And when she testified, her father was sitting close by. He's Sheikh Saud Nasir al-Sabah, Kuwait's ambassador to the United States. Nayira lives with her family in Washington, D.C. We can only speculate on the effect of the mysterious Nayira's testimony.
Afraid to use her real name in case
we can't say for certain it was part of a massive campaign by the public relations firm of Hill and Knowlton to, in their words, get Kuwait's story out. Others might call it the selling of the war. The troubling part of the story is the belief by the public relations industry that with enough access, enough money, and knowing which buttons to push, war can be marketed, just like soft drinks and toothpaste.
Now, to give you some additional context, Americans did not support this war until this entire elaborate scheme, this PR event, was concocted. And this is what got them to turn public opinion. And once he felt as if he had a mandate to do war, we hid photos of atrocities that the American military committed with the direction of George H.W. Bush to keep public support maintained for that war. And I'm only talking about what he did in the Middle East. I'm not even telling you about what he did in Panama that led to thousands of civilians dying, being killed by the U.S. military. We didn't even talk about the revelations that came to light in the bombshell documentary, The Panama Deception, where the United States military was actually doing dangerous weapons tests in Panama, and they were killing civilians. And again, I can't even get into all of these war crimes with the level of specificity that they deserve, because there's too many to count. So those are just some basic examples as to how George H.W. Bush was directly responsible for the deaths of thousands of people. But he was also indirectly responsible for the deaths of people here in America. Because when he was president, there was an HIV and AIDS crisis that affected the gay community, and since he was overtly homophobic, much like his predecessor, Ronald Reagan, he chose to not act, resulting in tens of thousands of people dying every single year. And he gave one speech on the subject. That was it. One speech was all that gay Americans got when activists were begging him to speak up. They were protesting at the White House. They were literally spreading ashes of gay Americans that passed away on the White House in order to get him to speak out, in order to get him to take action. Now, he eventually, thankfully, signed a bill that funded AIDS treatment and prohibited discrimination against gay Americans through the American with Disabilities Act, but this came only after he initially cut funding for AIDS research and banned people with HIV from entering the United States. So to say that his response to the AIDS crisis at a time when it was getting worse was inadequate, I mean, that would be a gross understatement. Because he didn't want to take action, because he was a homophobe. He was worried about upsetting his right-wing base, so he felt as if it was more convenient to just ignore the fact that thousands of gay Americans were dying every single year, rather than taking action until basically the outpouring was so severe that he couldn't ignore it any longer. And I'm barely scratching the surface, because I didn't even tell you about his racism. I didn't even get to his decision to pardon the individuals that were involved in the Iran-Contra scandal. I didn't even tell you about the numerous women that came forward and alleged that he groped them, including one who was 16 years old. I mean, his legacy is so unbelievably problematic. You could write multiple books about it, and people have, but at the same time, people in the mainstream media are fawning praise over him when we need to take a sober look at him so that way we can learn from what he did wrong and make sure that we learn from history and right those wrongs and not do what he did. But because in America we're so eager to deify American presidents, this is what happens. We sweep everything that they did under the rug that was bad, and we pretend as if it doesn't happen. And all it takes is time. And then we rehabilitate them, and we parade them around as if they are supposedly good people, as if they're American heroes. That's what we're doing to George W. Bush, who's going on the Ellen Show and is getting these cutesy articles written about him, about how he's sharing candy with Michelle Obama. And I bet this will be what we do in 8 years after Trump is out of office. We'll say, look at this Republican and how bad he or she is when juxtaposed with Trump. Trump really was, we didn't like him at the time, but I mean, he wasn't as bad as this individual. This is what we do in America. We rehabilitate the legacy of war criminals because it makes us feel better about ourselves, because we don't want to be introspective and look at all of the horrible things our tax dollars funded, and look at all the horrible things our presidents, who we elected, did to civilians and innocent lives across the world. So while we watch our media fawn over him and worship him essentially because he was polite, unlike Donald Trump, I'm going to leave you with some words from Jeremy Scahill, who says, George H.W. Bush was an unrepentant war criminal. May his many victims across the globe rest in peace. And since so many people in the media are going out of their way to honor him and pay tribute to him, since that's already being done, on this show, we're going to take the time to pay tribute to all of his victims and honor them for the suffering that they endured at the hands of this war criminal. So we'll end this segment with a moment of silence for those people.
Support this podcast by becoming a patron at patreon.com/thought-provoking. facebook.com/Humanist Report.